long association with the Medici court as singer, accompanist, and composer. In 1598, he produced La Daphne, followed 2 years later by Eurydice for the wedding festivities of Maria de' Medici and Henry IV of France. Peri also composed for the musically distinguished Mantuan court. Peri often collaborated with other composers, such as the brothers Giovanni Battista da Gagliano and Marco da Gagliano. While only a small handful of these works survive as testament to Peri's talent, they nonetheless laid down the template that later opera composers would follow. Peri died in Florence in 1633. His gravestone in the Florentine church of Santa Maria Novella describes him as the inventor of opera. Other key works: 1598 La Daphne, 1609 Sierra Leonean Leones Vari Musique. See also Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme Dido and Aeneas Orfeo ed Eurydice the Magic Flute. The Barber of Seville. In context. Focus. Birth of the Baroque before 1587. Andrea Gabrieli publishes Concerti, a collection of sacred ceremonial music for voices and instruments, introducing the cori spezzati style. 1602. Lodovico Viadana publishes Concerti Ecclesiastici for 1 to 4 voices, the earliest composition with a basso continuo, a chordal instrumental accompaniment. December 1602. Giulio Caccini premieres Eurydice based on the same libretto as Jacopo Peri's Eurydice, introducing style recitativo, inspired by the dramas of the ancient Greeks. 1607. Monteverdi composes his groundbreaking first opera, L'Orfeo, based on the Greek legend of Orpheus. After 1619. Heinrich Schütz, a pupil of Giovanni Gabrieli, publishes Psalmen Davids, a collection of psalm settings. He goes on, in 1629, to produce 3 sets of Symphonie Sacrée, which give equal importance to voices and instruments. Monteverdi's Vespers for the Blessed Virgin of 1610 is one of the most influential collections of sacred works for voices and instruments of the 17th century. No larger choral work had been written before, and none as long nor as innovative appeared again until J.S. Bach's Passions and Handel's Oratorios in the 18th century. Choral Leap. Written for Vespers, the early evening service in the Catholic Church, in particular Vespers in honor of the Virgin Mary, Monteverdi's Vespers marks the transition from the old polyphonic style known as prima pratica of the Renaissance, in which all voices are equal, to the freer Baroque style known as seconda pratica, with its emphasis on solo voice. In the latter, harmonies became more adventurous, with greater use of monody, in which a melody was underpinned by an instrumental continuo, or bass line, in the form of the organ, harpsichord, or lute. The bass lines also became more melodic. Embellishments, which had previously been improvised by the performer, were more elaborate and often fully notated by the composer. These developments led to the distinct musical characteristics of the Baroque period, in which irregularity and extreme expression sometimes disturbed the smooth musical flow, compelling the attention of listeners. Contrasts of melody, texture, timbre, tempo, and rhythm abound in Baroque music. In addition, instruments assumed a more important role and their music was more idiomatic, reflecting greater technique and better made, more reliable instruments. The new style was taken up in most forms of music. The greater use of figured bass lent themselves to opera and oratorio. In vocal music, the melody projected the thoughts, emotions, actions, and reactions of a character in an opera, or even in an accompanied song. The new emphasis on character led to the development of the accompanied sonata, the solo recitative and aria, and the concerto, indeed, any musical form showcasing one particular performer among the group. This stylistic development emphasized contrast, allowing for wider emotional expression in vocal music and for more rhythmic variation in expressing and projecting the text. It stimulated experimentation among composers, who explored increasing instrumental virtuosity. Cremona Cathedral, where the young Monteverdi is thought to have studied composition under the choirmaster Marcantonio Ingegneri. The end of all good music is to affect the soul. Claudio Monteverdi. Sacred music. While the old polyphonic style continued to be widely used in European church music during the first half of the 17th century, a new style called concertato style, contrasting multiple choirs and instrumentalists, developed in Venice and spread to Germany. In England, this new trend was reflected in the verse anthem, in which verses for solo voices alternated with choral passages. A virtuosic Vespers. Monteverdi's Vespers was one of the first pieces of sacred music to exploit the rich possibilities of seconda pratica, but the composer did not forget the advantages of prima pratica and set the texts that are strictly liturgical in traditional plainsong. The usual musical sequence for the Vespers service consisted of 8 movements, starting with an opening, versicle, that began with the words, Deus in adjutorium meam intend. The original 1610 edition of Vespers contains 13 movements, and includes a version of the Magnificat for 6 voices and organ. In addition to music for Vespers itself, the volume includes an a cappella mass setting, Missa in illo tempore, based upon a motet of the same name by the Renaissance composer Nicholas Gombert. Within the 13 movements of Vespers, Monteverdi sets 5 psalms that honor the Virgin Mary, together with Ave Maris Stella, an 8th century hymn to Mary that precedes the Magnificat in the official set of daily prayers, and the Magnificat itself. Monteverdi uses plainsong as the basis of the 7 sections. The repeated return to plainsong provides a compositional thread that connects the very different Renaissance and early Baroque styles. It also helped ensure that his work would not alienate the church. Claudio Monteverdi. Born in Cremona in 1567, Monteverdi began composing music while still a teenager, producing a collection of 3-part motets and a book of madrigals. These achievements enabled him to leave Cremona to become a string player at the court of Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga in Mantua, where he was influenced by the court's maestro di cappella, Giaches de Wert, and started writing operas. In 1607, his first opera, L'Orfeo, was performed in Mantua, followed by L'Arianna in 1608. After Gonzaga's death in 1612, Monteverdi went to Rome, where he presented his Vespers to the Pope. The following year he became maestro di cappella at St. Mark's, Venice. His final opera L'Incoronazione di Pappia was performed in 1642, the year before he died. Other key works: 1605 Fifth Book of Madrigals, 1607 L'Orfeo, 1641 Selva Morale e Spirituale, 1642 L'Incoronazione di Pappia. Sacred Concertos. In addition to Monteverdi's 5 psalm settings, the Ave Maris Stella setting, and the Magnificat, he set 4 antiphons, short sentences sung or recited before or after a psalm or canticle. The first 2 antiphons come from the Old Testament's Song of Solomon. They are Nigra sum, sed formosa and pulchra es, sung by 2 sopranos whose lines interweave as if in a love duet. In the third antiphon, Duo seraphim, 2 angels call across the heavens, and in the fourth, Audi colam, the endings of the words sung by one tenor are echoed by another, creating an otherworldly effect. For example, the first singer's gaudio is echoed as audio. Devices such as repeated phrases for emphasis might have appeared in an opera. Monteverdi dedicated and presented his Vespers to Pope Paul V, a member of the powerful Borghese family, possibly in the hope of commissions. The Vesper settings are completed by the Sonata Sopra Sancta Maria. Together, the 4 antiphons and the sonata were described by Monteverdi as sacred concertos. Sonata and concerto are terms that date from the 18th century, when they had slightly different meanings and usage from today. Until around 1650, sonata was used interchangeably with canzona, an instrumental composition employing repetition, while concerto simply meant an ensemble piece for voices and instruments. Monteverdi's intentions. It is not known whether Monteverdi expected to hear the Vespers sung as a complete work. There is little evidence that any of the 1610 publication was actually performed during his lifetime, and it is not known whether the Vesper movements were ever performed together. Some scholars have suggested that Vespers is simply a collection of religious settings honoring the Virgin Mary, which were published together for convenience. The publication may have been intended by the composer as two works, Vespers and Mass, complete in their own right, and also as a compendium of sacred music from which to draw movements for different occasions when expert singers and instrumentalists were available, such as at a court like Mantua, St. Peter's in Rome, or St. Mark's in Venice. A minimum of 10 voices is required to perform Vespers, and instrumental and vocal parts require enormous dexterity. For the more choral sections, such as Laudate Pueri, Dixit Dominus, and the closing movement of the Magnificat, some performances contrast large choirs with smaller ensembles using the cori spezzati technique to create a stereo effect. Instruments are only specified for certain sections of the work, the opening fanfare borrowed from Monteverdi's opera Orfeo of 1607, the Sonata, and sections of the Magnificat. Music in Venice. Few other cities in Europe have a longer or more glorious musical tradition than Venice. In the Baroque age, it was a major center of the arts and a powerful trading hub, with a great tradition of church and state ceremonies requiring music. The fame of Venetian composers, such as Andrea and Giovanni Gabrieli, Monteverdi, and Vivaldi, rivals that of the city's artists, Bellini, Titian, Veronese, Tintoretto, and Tiepolo. Opera first found a mass following in the city, with the opening of the world's first opera house, the Teatro di San Casciano, in 1637. In the 19th century, Rossini saw some of his greatest triumphs in Venice, while Wagner, a regular visitor who later died in the city, composed Tristan und Isolde here, and Verdi premiered Rigoletto and La Traviata at Teatro La Fenice, the chief opera house from 1792. In the 20th century, Stravinsky's The Rake's Progress and Benjamin Britten's The Turn of the Screw were also premiered here. I would rather be moderately praised for the new style than greatly praised for the ordinary. Claudio Monteverdi. The Family in Concert, c. 1752, by the Venetian artist Pietro Lonhi, who specialized in contemporary domestic scenes. A page from a manuscript shows Monteverdi's handwritten notation for L'Incoronazione di Papia of 1642, his last work before his death in 1643. Voices and instruments. Contemporaries were sometimes critical of Monteverdi's change in style from the traditional prima pratica to the more operatic seconda pratica technique he used in the sacred concertos and also in his madrigals. They may have found this sort of writing too ostentatious for religious music. One writer, Giovanni Artusi, attacked the Baroque style, quoting madrigals by Monteverdi in support of his arguments. He found the use of dissonance, unorthodox key changes, and irregular cadences objectionable. However, Monteverdi did not see the two techniques as radically different. They were both ways of setting a text expressively and of being faithful to it. See also, Plainchant Magnus Liber Organi Messe de Notre Dame Missa Pange Lingua Canticum Canticorum. In context. Focus French Baroque before 1626 Les 24 Violons du Roi, the King's Orchestra, is founded, an ensemble in which Lully later performs. 1647 The premiere is held of Luigi Rossi's opera Orpheus, the first opera commissioned by the French court. After 1691 Henry Purcell composes his opera King Arthur, with shivering effects in the violins, allegedly influenced by Lully's opera Isis. 1693 Marc-Antoine Charpentier's opera Midi is indebted to Lully's style. 1733 Jean-Philippe Rameau's Hippolyte et Thérèse is the first French opera to depart from Lully's style, and the first piece of music to be described as Baroque. The 1670 comedy ballet Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, devised by the French composer Jean-Baptiste Lully and the playwright and actor Molière, represents the high point of this specifically French genre. It was the culmination of a series of comedy ballets by the two men who were known as Les Deux Baptistes. The comedy ballet genre mixed spoken drama with music and dance, ballet having long been enjoyed at the court of King Louis XIV. The story of Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, the foolish Monsieur Jourdain, who has delusions of grandeur, is told through a mixture of spoken dialogue written by Molière, interspersed with lively orchestral interludes and dances by Lully. The choruses and solo arias were the work of both men. I do not believe there is any sweeter music under the heaven than Lully's. Madame de Sévigné. French aristocrat. Dramatic skill. Lully was a skilled musician, dancer, and actor, and this is evident in his compositions. Instead of merely accompanying the singers, Lully's orchestra enhances the drama of his works, commenting on the actions of the characters and creating a sense of place and occasion. His earlier ballet de Muses anticipated the rise of the concerto, by pitting solo instrumental passages against alternating orchestral responses. Examples of virtuosity and complexity are often evident in Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, particularly in the quickfire exchanges between characters, in the whirling violin and flute ornamentations of the Spanish tunes, and in the stately flourishes of the overture. Over the course of 5 acts, Lully uses every tool at his disposal, from popular dance forms, such as jigs and minuets, to drinking songs and even a grandiose, Turkish, march with lively percussion. Although Lully was not the innovator of musical Orientalism, he is widely credited with spreading its influence in the 18th century. His use of a scene-setting overture, an orchestral, march-like introduction usually to allow for royal pageantry and homage to be paid, became a standard musical feature for almost all subsequent operas. A skilled violinist, Lully performed in his own works. He is thought to be the man holding the violin in François Puget's painting of 1688. Enter the conductor. Lully's increased instrumentation, with 5-part strings, woodwind, and percussion, meant that Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme was one of the earliest pieces of music to require a conductor to coordinate the timing of both singers and orchestra. Indeed, there is an etching of Lully's later opera, Alceste, premiered in 1674, that shows a man beating time on the floor with a staff. Unfortunately for Lully, it was this vigorous method of musical direction that precipitated his untimely demise. In March 1687, he died from a gangrenous wound that developed after a blow to his toe while beating time as he conducted his own Te Deum. Jean-Baptiste Lully. Born into a family of Florentine millers in 1632, Giovanni Battista Lully began his rise through French society when he gained a position as a servant at the French court at the age of 14. He attracted the attention of Louis XIV, with whom he later danced in courtly spectacles. By 1661, he had been placed in charge of court music, at which point he Gallicized his name. Lully's monopoly on French opera enabled him to produce multiple works of his own creation. His prolific output before his early death in 1687 also included chamber music and sacred works. Other key works: 1663 Miserere Mei Deus, 1674 Alceste, 1677 Te Deum, 1686 Armide. See also, Le Jeu de Robin et de Marion, Eurydice, Hippolyte et Eurydice, Orfeo ed Eurydice, The Magic Flute, The Barber of Seville, de Freischutz, La Traviata Tosca. In context. Focus. Baroque opera in England before 1617. Lovers Made Men, a masque by Ben Jonson, is set to music by Nicholas Lanier in the Italian recitative style. 1656. The Siege of Rhodes, by 5 composers, is considered the first English opera, but is called recitative music, to avoid the Puritan ban on plays. Circa 1683. John Blow's Venus and Adonis is premiered at Charles II's court. 1685. Albion and Albanius, with a libretto by John Dryden set to music by Louis Grabu, is the earliest full-length English opera to survive in its entirety. After 1705. Jacob Grieber's Gli Amori di Ergasto is the first Italian opera produced in London. 1711. Handel premieres the Italian opera Rinaldo, his first work for the London stage. The greatness of Dido and Aeneas by Henry Purcell lies in the perfection of its characterization and musical depth. Although conceived on a miniature scale, it is the most significant early English opera and a masterpiece of the entire Baroque musical era. In the late 17th century, when Dido and Aeneas was composed, opera was still in its infancy in England. It had evolved in Florence in the 1590s from a form of private entertainment organized by groups of artists and musicians known as academies. From there, it had spread throughout Italy with performances in one or other of the many small courts. Only in 1637, with the opening of the Teatro di San Cassiano in Venice, was opera performed for a wider public. The new genre had reached Germany by this time and France by the 1640s, quickly taking root in both countries. In England, opera advanced more slowly, partly because of a prejudice against sung drama in a country where spoken drama was dominant. England also lacked a royal court around which operatic tradition could develop, due to the exile of the future King Charles II following the defeat of the Cavaliers in the English Civil War and the establishment of a protectorate under the rule of the Puritan Oliver Cromwell. During this period, English composers were often not exposed to foreign influences, and their music tended to retain a strong national identity. Forms such as the verse anthem, in which solo voices and choir sang alternate verses, were favored in Anglican liturgy. Secular music included catches, simple, often bawdy rounds or canons, usually sung in taverns, which had no direct continental equivalents. Dido and Aeneas is one of the most original expressions of genius in all opera. Gustav Holst. Puritans showed disdain for the flamboyantly dressed cavaliers in a 17th-century tavern scene. Cromwell closed many inns and theaters, which he called bastions of lascivious mirth. A mysterious genesis. The restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660 brought England closer to Europe and its musical repertoire. This would have influenced Purcell as he developed his skills composing masterly anthems and songs from the age of 16. Many of these early works show the depth of imagination that would later make Dido and Aeneas such a powerful work. Surprisingly little is known about the creation of Dido and Aeneas. The earliest surviving manuscripts date from several decades after Purcell's death, and some material, such as music for his librettist Nahum Tate's prologue, has been lost. There is also a mystery about when and where the work was first performed. Although it was staged at Josiah's Priest's boarding school for young ladies in Chelsea in the late 1680s, some suggest that it was commissioned originally for the court of Charles II. There is, however, no evidence of any performance in the proposed period. Priest himself was a choreographer and dancing master who knew Purcell from stage productions on which they had both worked. John Blow's Venus and Adonis, the model for Dido and Aeneas and also an opera with a prologue and 3 acts, had been revived by Priest and his pupils and premiered at court around 1683. Dido entertains Aeneas in a scene by an unknown 18th-century Italian artist. While based on Virgil's epic poem, Purcell's opera used witches, rather than gods, to separate the lovers. The continental influence. While Purcell drew on the style of his English predecessors and contemporaries such as Matthew Locke and Blow, European musical models are evident in Dido and Aeneas and other works. During his years in exile, Charles II had acquired a taste for French and Italian music. Such preferences influenced aspiring musicians eager for royal patronage. French influences are noticeable from the start of Dido and Aeneas. Act 1 starts with a typical French overture, its slow, stately introduction based on intense dotted rhythms. The second part of the overture is fast, using imitative counterpoint, as well as a structural device by which sections are repeatedly built up from a short aria, followed by a chorus, and then a dance. The opera included several dances, a feature common for French and English operas of the time. Such dances would no doubt have pleased the dancing master, Priest, when the opera was staged at his school. Equally noticeable is the impact of Italian opera, and specifically of Did One, another opera about Dido and Aeneas by Francesco Cavalli. Both operas employ a ground bass or passacaglia, in which the bass line is repeated throughout with changing melodies and harmonies above it. Purcell uses this to great dramatic effect for two of Dido's arias, including her lament, which comes close to the end of the score and provides a natural climax to the whole drama. Henry Purcell. Born in 1659, when court life was about to be restored with the accession of Charles II, Purcell was a thoroughly trained musician. In his relatively brief career, he acquired the range of skills needed to succeed in every available genre. He was a boy chorister in the Chapel Royal, and, as an adult, held a series of court appointments, writing music for state occasions in addition to works for church and chamber, songs, and harpsichord suites. As the organist of Westminster Abbey from 1680, he worked close to London's West End and wrote incidental music for dozens of plays. He also collaborated on a series of dramatic or semi-operas with substantial musical content, including King Arthur and the Faerie Queene. He died in 1695 during the composition of the Indian Queen, leaving his brother to complete the work. Other key works: 1691 King Arthur, 1692 The Faerie Queene, 1694 Come, Ye Sons of Art, 1695 Funeral Music for Queen Mary. A musical revival. The creative foundations for England's music and drama were in a poor state when Charles II came to the throne in 1660. The Puritans had closed London's theatres from around 1642 and, abhorring music in places of worship, had even disbanded cathedral choirs. Charles's interest in the arts and his subsequent support for them was part of a wider policy of encouraging entertainment. This influenced music in several ways. Charles created a royal string orchestra modeled on the 24 violons du roi at the court of Louis XIV. It played for church services and court occasions, performing birthday odes by Purcell and others. The post of Master of the King's Music was reinstated with the reappointment of Nicholas Lanier. Foundations such as the Chapel Royal, which trained professional musicians, were also renewed. New theatres were opened and thrived, producing what is now called restoration drama, often bawdy comedies, for which songs and incidental music were required, frequently supplied by Purcell himself. As poetry is the harmony of words, so music is that of notes, and as poetry is a rise above prose, so is music the exaltation of poetry. Henry Purcell. Dramatic effects. As it has survived, Dido and Aeneas consists of 3 short acts telling the story of the arrival in ancient Carthage of Aeneas, the classical hero of Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid. Having escaped from the burning city of Troy at the end of the Trojan War, he had sailed with his followers to North Africa. There he woos the Carthaginian queen Dido, a wary widow who finally submits to his advances. Wicked witches plot against her, however, sending an imp in the likeness of Mercury to call Aeneas away to his glorious destiny as the founder of Rome. In despair at his departure, Dido commits suicide. Purcell masterfully employs stirring motifs and deft word painting to express the fluctuating moods that shape the action. Throughout the opera's varied movements, Purcell's text and music work together in perfect synergy to evoke the necessary emotions of sadness, joy, or the evil intent of the witches. Music and poetry, walking hand in hand, support each other. An ideal Purcell expressed in the dedication of his semi-opera. As a child, Purcell served as a chorister of the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, England, a training ground for young musicians. Diocletian. His use of melismas, setting one syllable on several notes, is striking, enhancing the effect of descriptions of valor, torment, and Dido, languishing, in grief in her recitative. Whence could so much virtue spring? Purcell also intentionally creates dissonance in the string parts during Dido's lament, to express the queen's extreme anguish in one of the most moving musical statements of grief ever composed. The last death scene is remarkable, too, in an era when operatic heroes or heroines seldom perished. In Cavalli's Dido, Dido is saved from herself and marries someone else. A lasting legacy. Little is known about performances of Dido and Aeneas in Purcell's lifetime. It was revived on the London stage in 1700 and again in 1704, yet these productions seem to have been the last until the late 19th century. Increasingly performed ever since, it is now regularly presented by schools and amateurs as well as in the world's great opera houses. The accession of William III to the throne in 1689 diminished court patronage, although Purcell wrote fine odes for William's consort Queen Mary until 1694. Theatre work dominated Purcell's last years. Here the chief form was that of dramatic or semi-opera. This very English type of entertainment comprised a play with interludes of songs, dances, and choruses at the ends of acts. These had little direct connection to the play and were performed by a separate company of singers and dancers. The best-known examples are King Arthur, to a text by the poet John Dryden, and The Faerie Queen, whose spoken text is an adaptation by the actor-manager Thomas Betterton of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Purcell's other works ranged from church and chamber music to songs and formal odes. His Dido and Aeneas suggests, however, that, but for his early death at the age of 36, Purcell could have laid the ground for an English operatic tradition. That space would eventually be filled by the German-born George Frideric Handel, who would compose his own operas in London between 1711 and 1741. The score of Dido and Aeneas uses a simple bass line which may have been provided by cello, bassoon, double bass, or bass viol, as shown here by Dutch artist Caspar Netschers. Music is yet but in its nonage a forward child, which gives hope of what it may be hereafter in England, when the masters of it shall find more encouragement. Henry Purcell. See also, Eurydice Orfeo ed Eurydice the Magic Flute the Barber of Seville La Traviata Peter Grimes. In context. Focus. Lutheran hymn tunes before 1529 Martin Luther composes the hymn Ein Fest Burg. 1624 Samuel Scheidt publishes his Tablatura Nova, a collection of keyboard music containing 8 sets of chorale variations. After 1705-1706 J.S. Bach walks from Arnstadt to Lübeck, a distance of 235 miles to meet and hear Buxtehude. 1726 J.S. Bach completes the final chorales in his Orgelbuchlein, his largest collection of chorale preludes. 1830 Felix Mendelssohn bases the finale of his Reformation Symphony on Luther's Ein Fest Burg. When, in 1517, Martin Luther penned the 95 Theses that would trigger the Reformation, his main objections had little to do with music. They rather concerned the selling of indulgences and the question of papal authority. As the Reformation got underway, however, church music was to be profoundly affected. For centuries, singing in church had been the preserve of monks and trained singers, and being in Latin, it was incomprehensible to the average person in the congregation. Luther placed particular emphasis on congregational participation and on the use of the vernacular, so that everyone could understand what they were hearing and singing. The chorale, a congregational hymn, was key to this. Luther himself composed many of the earliest chorales, of which perhaps the most famous is his Ein Fest Burg, based on Psalm 46. A mighty fortress is our God, a tower of strength never failing. By the Baroque period, chorale melodies formed the basis for many different genres of music in the Lutheran Church. One of these was the chorale prelude, a short organ piece to introduce the melody of the chorale so that people would know what tune to sing. Signature trait. The chief pioneer of the chorale prelude was Dietrich Buxtehude. His practice was to present the chorale melody in an ornamented version in one single upper voice, projected by the right hand on a separate manual, while the left hand and pedals provided an accompaniment, normally on softer-sounding stops. Buxtehude drew some influence from the works of earlier composers, such as the keyboard variations of the Dutch organist Jan Pieterszoon Sweelinck and his pupil Samuel Scheidt. But while Scheidt often presented the tune of the chorale in slower, unornamented notes, and wove the variations around it, Buxtehude made the chorale melody itself the clearest and most ornamented line, with the variations being simpler. Buxtehude's prelude on Ein Fest Berg ist unser Gott, composed around 1690, is a perfect example of this approach. The right hand presents a spontaneous-sounding solo melody that follows the contour of the chorale tune. The chorale itself is made clearer by the fact that each of its notes is either held for longer than the decorative, improvisatory notes that connect them, or is presented as the first of a collection of 4 notes. The accompaniment in the left hand and pedals is generally in 2 or 3-part harmony, sometimes using motifs from the chorale melody and interweaving them imitatively, while at other times opting for a chordal approach. In this manner the tune is presented once from beginning to end. This particular style of setting influenced J.S. Bach, who followed a similar model in his chorale preludes. To comprehend one thing and another about his art. J.S. Bach. An Allegory of Friendship by Dutch artist Johannes Voorhout shows Buxtehude leaning on his elbow. Among the other musicians is the harpsichordist Johann Adam Reinken. Dietrich Buxtehude. It is uncertain exactly when and where Dietrich Buxtehude was born, but by his early childhood, his family was living in Helsingborg, from where they later moved to Helsingør in Denmark. It was there that Buxtehude learned his musical craft from his organist father. After working at his father's former church in Helsingborg, and then at St. Mary's Church in Helsingør, in 1668 Buxtehude accepted the prestigious position of organist at St. Mary's in Lübeck. Tradition held that new organists should marry a daughter of their predecessor, an obligation that Buxtehude fulfilled within weeks of taking up office. He retained his role as organist of Lübeck until his death in 1707. Other key works 1680 Member Jesu nos Streici. 1680 Preludum in C major 1694 Trio Sonatas, Op. 1. See also, Plainchant Magnus Liber Organi Great Service Pieces de Clavecin Street Matthew Passion The Art of Fugue Elijah. In context. Focus. The Concerto Grosso before. 1610 The publication of Giovanni Cima's Sonata Tre for violin, cornet, and continuo, an early example of secular Italian chamber music for 3 instruments. 1675 The first performance of Alessandro Stradella's Sonata di Viol No. 25, which contrasts a soloist with an ensemble. Corelli is likely to have heard this during his time in Rome. After 1721 J.S. Bach puts together his Brandenburg concertos, several of which experiment with the instrumentation of both solo and ensemble groups. 1741 Handel's 12 Concerti Grossi, Op. 6, are published, in direct homage to Corelli's Concerti Grossi. The Italian term, concerto, was initially used to describe any music for voices and added instruments, with the distinction evolving in the early 17th century between concerti ecclesiastici and concerti di camera. By the late 18th century it had evolved into the much grander showcase for virtuosity that is familiar today, but its roots lie in the modest setup of a small group of soloists and a string ensemble with continuo, as developed by the Italian composer Arcangelo Corelli around the turn of the 18th century. Corelli's masterful Op. 6, Concerti Grossi, published posthumously as a set of 12, epitomized the form. Each of Corelli's concerti consists of 4 to 6 movements, played by a trio concertino, 3 soloists comprising 2 violins and a cello continuo, and the ripieno, a larger string ensemble with harpsichord accompaniment. Confusingly, Corelli often expanded the concertino section to 4 musicians. The basso continuo provided a continuous musical framework, or foundation, over which the melody and harmony of both the soloists and the accompanying group, or ripieno, were constructed. Corelli's early Concerti Grossi were premiered in Rome's Palazzo Pamphilj, a dazzling example of Italian Baroque architecture that reflected the order and playfulness of the music. It is wonderful to observe what a scratching of Corelli there is everywhere. Nothing will relish but Corelli. Roger North. Writer and musician. Dynamic expression. By employing these contrasting instrumental forces, Corelli explored the possibilities for dynamic expression, enlivening the exchanges between the sections through dramatic juxtapositions, often enhanced when the concertino ensemble joins in with the ripieno sections. The music ranges from serene adagios wrought with exquisite suspensions, to allegros, peppered with quick-fire exchanges between the large and small ensembles. Corelli's use of harmony in these concerti was in keeping with a more general shift in Italian Baroque music away from the myriad lines of Renaissance polyphony toward the use of chord sequences and cadences to create a stable tonal center. Corelli's work immediately attracted the admiration of patrons and fellow musicians. Among the Op. 6 concerti, No. 8 in G minor, subtitled Fado per la notte di Natale, was commissioned by his patron of the 1690s, Cardinal Pietro Ottoboni. Known as the Christmas Concerto, the work has enjoyed long-lasting popularity. Harmony and balance. Although Corelli had previously written for the concertino combination of instruments in his 48 trio sonatas, it is impossible to dismiss the concerti grossi as a mere inflation of these small-scale chamber works. Some performances involved as many as 80 musicians, a huge number, especially in Corelli's day, when orchestras more usually numbered around 20 musicians. In 1789, more than 70 years after Corelli's death, the English musician, composer, and music historian Dr. Charles Burney wrote of the concerti grossi. The effect of the whole, so majestic, solemn, and sublime that they preclude all criticism. Even today, their melodies continue to resonate. Arcangelo Corelli. Born into a prosperous family in the small Italian town of Fusignano, in 1653, Corelli was accepted into Bologna's Accademia Filarmonica Orchestra at the age of 17. His mastery of the violin, combined with the rigor of his teaching methods and his many pupils, who included Antonio Vivaldi and Francesco Geminiani, caused his reputation to grow. In the mid-1670s, Corelli moved to Rome, where he entered the service of Queen Christina of Sweden, who had a home in Rome, and later served as music director to Cardinal Pamphili. His last patron was Cardinal Pietro Ottoboni, who was himself a musician and librettist. Corelli died in 1713. Despite his relatively modest output, his most active composing years coincided with a boom in music publishing at the turn of the 18th century. As a result, his influence spread across Europe, even during his lifetime. Other key works: 1694 12 Trio Sonatas, Op. 4 1712 Violin Sonatas, Op. 5. See also, the Four Seasons Musique de Table Saint-Saëns Piano Concerto No. 2 in G minor. In context. Focus. French Baroque harpsichord music before 1670. Jacques Champion de Cherminières publishes Les Pièces de Clavecin, the first major French work on harpsichords. 1677. Nicolas Antoine Lebègue writes Les Pièces de Clavecin, the first dance suites published in France. After 1725. J.S. Bach includes Les Bergeries in his notebook for Anna Magdalena under the title of Rondo. 1753. C.P. Bach pens Volume 1 of Versuch über die War Art das Klavier zu spielen, a treatise influenced by Couperin's L'Art de toucher le clavecin. Until François Couperin's ordres, or suites, French keyboard music had largely taken the form of Baroque popular dances, such as the allemande, courante, and sarabande. However, in part due to his connections at the French court, Couperin was also familiar with Italian music, including the sonata, a piece and several movements for a small group of instruments, which involved no dancing or singing. Sonatas of this period usually had a two-part structure, with each half repeated. As seen in the more than 500 sonatas of Domenico Scarlatti, they tended to focus on technical virtuosity and the formal modulation of melodies, rather than changes of mood and feeling. I like better what touches me than what surprises me. François Couperin. Pièces de Clavecin. Ornamental flourishes. Although he used the sonata structure in his music, Couperin concentrated on grace and gesture, swayed by the prevailing French view of music as a sophisticated, elegant, and even frivolous pastime. Many of his works have descriptive titles, which he claimed were ideas that occurred to him as he was writing. The careful balance he struck between the light-hearted French sensibility and the more formal, structured Italian approach gave his work wide appeal. The keyboard works were written entirely for harpsichord or spinet. On these instruments, the player has no control of volume. Couperin incorporated subtle embellishments into his music to control its flow and intensity, and, unusually for the period, expected performers not to add to, or improvise around, what he had written. Furthermore, he published detailed instructions for these ornaments, marking the notes precisely as they should be played, thereby codifying such signs for later generations. His style was not to everyone's taste. While J.S. Bach arranged some of Couperin's works, he is said to have found them overly fussy. Such reliance on ornamentation tends to mean that Couperin's music translates less well onto the modern piano, which, with its fuller and more sustained sound, makes the decoration too prominent. This, coupled with his dislike of overt virtuosity and harmonic daring, may explain why his music has been eclipsed by Scarlatti's in the concert hall. Although not the first treatise on keyboard playing, Couperin's L'Art de toucher le clavecin was one of the most important, offering not a complete course, but advice for the player on body postures and technical issues. It included a series of 8 preludes for study and fingerings for some of Couperin's published pieces. Particularly forward-looking are his suggestions that children should master a few pieces before learning to read music and that practice should be supervised. These ideas anticipated some modern approaches to music education, such as the Suzuki method in the mid-20th century. A young girl learns to play the harpsichord in the music lesson by Jean-Honoré Fragonard. François Couperin taught music to Louis XIV's children at Versailles. Even within the dynasty of great musicians into which he was born in 1668, François Couperin was extraordinary. Appointed on the death of his father, Charles, to take over the role of organist at Saint Gervais Church in Paris at the tender age of 11, he went on to become one of the most sought-after performers and teachers in France. In 1693, Couperin was appointed by Louis XIV as organist at the Royal Chapel. He became court harpsichordist to Louis XV in 1717 and composed works for the royal family. He died in Paris in 1733. Couperin's series of ordres for keyboard are considered some of the most significant contributions to Baroque harpsichord music. Players of the instrument today still study l'art de toucher le clavecin in order to inform their performances. 1714. 1715 Les Concerts Royaux. 1724, 1725 Apotheoses. See also, Micrologus Scarlatti's Sonata in D minor, Musique de table Clementi's Piano Sonata in F sharp minor. In context. Focus. An international style before 1660s. Following the restoration of the monarchy in England, Charles II reinstates music to the English court. He favors the French style and particularly promotes dancing, a passion he acquired during his exile in France. 1670s. A group of professional musicians called the Music Meeting open a concert hall near Charing Cross, London. After 1727, Handel composes the anthem Zadok the Priest for George II's coronation. 1800s. Composers turn away from an international style to highlight the individuality of nations, finding inspiration in folk dance rhythms and nationalist themes. Until the late 19th century, England was often known as the land without music. Even though London had a thriving concert life, with the earliest tradition of public concerts in Europe, the fashion was to promote foreign composers and performers rather than native musicians. Both Handel and Johann Christian Bach moved to London to make the most of its opportunities, and composers such as Mozart and Haydn often visited the city as well-paid and feted musicians. George Friedrich Handel. Born in Halle, in northeastern Germany, in 1685, Handel received his earliest musical training from a local organist. While still a teenager, he moved to Hamburg to work as a composer and from there went to Italy. He developed his dramatic talent in the comic operas Rodrigo and Agrippina and the psalm setting Dixit Dominus. Returning to Hanover in 1710, Handel became Kapellmeister to the Elector of Hanover. He relocated to London a year later and lived there for the rest of his life. He later found fame with his oratorios, especially Messiah, and set a seal on his career with the music for the royal fireworks in 1749. Handel died a wealthy man and was buried with the great and the good in London's Westminster Abbey. Other key works: 1725 Rodelinda, HWV 1742 Messiah, HWV 56. 1749 The Music for the Royal Fireworks, HWV 3511751 Jephthah, HWV 70. Music as Pleasure. When Handel arrived in London in 1711, he already had a distinctive style that was rooted in his North German upbringing and influenced by his time in Italy. He had met Arcangelo Corelli and Domenico Scarlatti in Italy and achieved success with Italian operas and religious works there. He was also familiar with the work of Jean-Baptiste Lully, who dominated French music, and England's Henry Purcell. This cosmopolitanism appealed to London concertgoers, who welcomed Handel's avoidance of some of the florid excesses of high Baroque counterpoint that were favored by Bach. Handel was soon appointed director of music to the Duke of Chandos, who introduced him to other members of the English aristocracy. While employed by the Duke, Handel honed a new, more forthright style, which can be heard in his Chandos anthems and the Masque Assis and Galatea. It was also at this time that he wrote Esther, the first of his English oratorios, a genre for which he would become renowned. In 1717, George I asked Handel to compose the music for a barge trip down the Thames. The music needed to be sensational. The king wanted to make a big public statement to draw attention away from his son, the Prince of Wales, who was forming an opposing political faction. Handel had to balance a desire for novelty with the need for broad popular appeal. While a concert in a barge with some 50 performers was a novelty in itself, Handel added to the occasion by importing Bohemian horn players, whose elegant fanfares would have sounded very different from the hunting horns familiar to English audiences. Along with bassoons and trumpets, these helped the music carry in the open air. Essentially, water music is a blend of popular European styles. It starts with an overture in the uneven rhythms of the French style, incorporates dances that were fashionable across Europe at the time, and includes the most English of music, the hornpipe, which became the signature tune of the work. Ludwig van Beethoven. Handel presents water music to George I in a painting by the Belgian artist Edouard Hamann. According to newspaper reports, the whole river was filled with small boats and barges. Opera in London. In 1719, the Duke of Chandos and his friends, taking advantage of the growing interest in opera in England, inaugurated the Royal Academy of Music under a charter from the king. It was a commercial venture, formed as a joint stock corporation, with the aim of commissioning and performing new Italian operas in Britain. Handel was one of its 3 composers as well as its musical director. He traveled to Europe to engage the finest orchestral musicians and the most celebrated singers, including the Italian castrato Senesino and the soprano Francesca Cuzzoni. Handel understood the audience's continual hunger for novelty. When London audiences became used to these artists, he brought in another soprano, Faustina Bordoni, who built a rival fan base among the audience, reinvigorating interest in the opera for a few more seasons. The high fees paid to such luminaries may have been part of the reason that the company went out of business in 1728 with debts of around £20,000. "I should be sorry if I only entertained them. I wish to make them better." George Frideric Handel. Public music and concert going. London was the first city to establish public concerts with paying audiences. The trend began around 1672, when the violinist and composer John Bannister organized a paying concert in his own house. By the time Handel arrived in London, there were purpose-built venues for chamber music concerts. In addition, theatres in Drury Lane and the Haymarket offered Italian and later English opera to London's beau monde. From around 1740, pleasure gardens sprang up across the capital, most famously in Vauxhall. Here visitors would stroll, dine, and be entertained by live music from wind bands and orchestras. A rehearsal of Handel's music for the royal fireworks in Vauxhall Gardens, in 1749, attracted some 12,000 people, each paying 2 shillings and 6pence, and causing a 3-hour traffic jam on London Bridge. Master of Stagecraft. Handel wrote a series of 13 operas for the Royal Academy of Music, which had 235 performances in his lifetime. Masterpieces in the Italian style, they included Giulio Cesare in Igitto and Alcina. Although he used the operatic conventions of the day, recitatives and arias, to unfold the narrative, he gave the operas a dramatic structure that was unusual at the time. He also understood the importance of spectacle, and a number of his operas required elaborate stage machinery. In Alcina, which was written for the new opera house at Covent Garden, the stage directions include: with lightning and thunder, the mountain crumbles, revealing Alcina's delightful palace. Such stage effects attracted audiences just as much as the music. Handel understands effect better than any of us. When he chooses, he strikes like a thunderbolt. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He saw men and women where others have seen only historical mythical busts. Paul Henry Lang. Music critic. A new direction. When Italian opera went out of fashion in London after the extraordinary success in 1728 of John Gay's The Beggar's Opera, which satirized the form, Handel used his skills to create and popularize oratorios in English. Starting with Deborah, these thrillingly dramatic works for solo singers, chorus, and orchestra told biblical stories with English-language librettos, but were performed unstaged in theaters. To some extent influenced by. The band plays music from an illuminated bandstand in London's Vauxhall Gardens, UK, while visitors stroll and dance in the open air. Operatic traditions, and even Greek tragedy, Handel developed a directness of style and a new kind of robustness that appealed to British audiences. The public flocked to hear works such as Messiah, Samson, and Belshazzar. Messiah was so popular that men were asked to attend performances without their swords to create more room for the audience. Handel often presented these works himself, renting theaters and hiring performers, and often netting a good profit. When a rival company provided stiff competition, Handel wrote a number of organ concertos which he performed as interludes during the performances. Unusual as this was, it provided a rare opportunity to hear his great keyboard virtuosity in public and was therefore something of a marketing masterstroke. The Handelian oratorio became so popular that Handel wrote secular works in the same style. He designated Semele, which was based on classical mythology, as a musical drama, after the manner of an oratorio, and even presented it during the Lenten period, when its depiction of adultery caused consternation. Works such as this were essentially operas in English and are usually performed as such today. Handel knew how to please an audience. Water music contains popular dance forms from different parts of Europe. National yet international. During a period when music was considered ephemeral and works were seldom heard in the years after their first performances, Handel was considered a major composer in his lifetime. He was probably the first composer whose work did not suffer a fall in popularity after his death. In England, he helped to broaden interest in music beyond the confines of the aristocracy, and created a national musical identity in an international style that lasted until Edward Elgar in the late 19th century. His anthem Zadok the Priest, composed for the coronation of George II, is still used in the crowning of British monarchs today. Louis François Rabillac's memorial to Handel stands above his tomb in Westminster Abbey, UK. Just 3 days before his death, Handel said that he wished to be buried there. See also Gabrielli's Sonata Piani Forte Eurydice, The Four Seasons, The Magic Flute, Elijah La Traviata, The Rings Cycle, Tosca. In context. Focus. Italian Baroque Sonata before 1701. Baroque composer Arcangelo Corelli publishes his violin sonatas, Op. 5, an early example of solo instrumental writing. 1709 Antonio Vivaldi publishes 12 sonatas for violin and basso continuo, Op. 2, again showcasing the virtuosic abilities of a solo instrument. After 1784 Mozart publishes Piano Sonata No. 1, K279, following in Scarlatti's footsteps with his focus on solo keyboard writing. 1795 Beethoven publishes Piano Sonata No. 1, Op. 2, continuing Scarlatti's experimentation with the genre. The Italian virtuoso harpsichord player and composer Domenico Scarlatti published his first edition of Esercizi per Gravicembalo in 1738. As the title of the collection suggests, the 30 sonatas were intended to be etudes for students of the harpsichord, although by Scarlatti's own admission, the originality of their content belies their seemingly mundane and practical purpose. A contemporary of both J.S. Bach and George Friedrich Handel, Scarlatti's dazzling skills on the keyboard were legendary, his dancing fingers described by one astonished British observer as resembling 1,000 devils. Scarlatti allegedly once had a public contest of keyboard skills with Handel, a musical duel that, by all accounts, ended in a draw. Scarlatti put his talents to use at the highest level of royal service, tutoring Maria Barbara when she was both Princess of Portugal and later Queen of Spain. It was her aptitude for the instrument and her continuous employment of Scarlatti that provided the conditions for his groundbreaking Esercizi. A family poses with their harpsichord in a 1739 work by Cornelis Troost. The instrument's popularity would soon wane in favor of the piano. For bold playing of the harpsichord. How yourself more human than critical, and thus increase your own pleasure. Live happily. Domenico Scarlatti. Scarlatti's sonata style. The term sonata derives from the Italian verb suonare, meaning to sound, and generally denotes solo instrumental music, that is, music which is sounded, as opposed to sung. In the early 18th century, Italian composers such as Arcangelo Corelli, Antonio Vivaldi, and Tommaso Albinoni had written widely for solo instruments, the violin being a particularly popular choice, but their sonatas tended to consist of 3 to 4 movements of contrasting moods. However, Scarlatti's sonatas for the solo harpsichord, at that point, a relatively neglected instrument, typically follow a two-part, single-movement structure, often pivoting around a central crux, or pause, and tending to be of shorter proportions, lasting only around 3 to 4 minutes in total. The Pastorale. Although he was influenced by the sarabans and courantes of his contemporaries, Scarlatti's music of this era is unique in its use of folk idioms taken from his Iberian surroundings. The Sonata K9 in D minor is nicknamed the Pastorale. This is in part due to the deceptive simplicity of its melody but also owing to the traditional music it evoked, including elements of Spanish folk dance music such as the strumming, percussive effects of Spanish guitar. This addition of country stylings to the formal courtly influences was to continue to define Scarlatti's music. He broke down the expectations of Baroque chamber music convention, experimenting with dissonance and syncopation in his later sonatas. It is such playful jesting with art that places Scarlatti as a master of both Baroque music and the evolving classical style. Scarlatti helped pave the way for the still more radical sonata experiments of Mozart and Beethoven that followed and that further emphasized the importance of freestyle, expressive melody lines over the more formal structure of Baroque music. Domenico Scarlatti. The son of the prolific opera composer, Alessandro Scarlatti, Domenico Scarlatti was born in Naples in 1685. A talented musician himself, he followed his father into a musical career of wide-ranging commissions and royal patronage. At 16 he became composer and organist to the Royal Chapel in Naples before going on to serve the exiled Polish queen, Maria Casimira, in Rome. He later became maestro di cappella at St. Peter's. In 1721, Scarlatti joined the Portuguese court in Lisbon, where he gave music lessons to Princess Maria Barbara. When the princess married Fernando VI of Spain, she summoned Scarlatti to be her music tutor. He served the Queen until his death in Madrid in 1757. Scarlatti is mainly known for his 555 keyboard sonatas, although he also produced a huge quantity of chamber and sacred vocal music. Other key works: 1724 Stabat Mater for 10 voices, 1757 Salve Regina. See also, Pieces de Clavecin, Musique de Table, Clementi's Piano Sonata in F sharp minor, Op. 25, No. 5, Eroica, Symphony. In context. Focus. Italian Baroque Solo Concerto before 1692. Giuseppe Torelli, based in Bologna, publishes the first of 3 collections of concertos that give a new prominence to the solo violinist. 1707 Concertos published by the Venetian Tommaso Albinoni used the 3-movement structure that will become the standard. 1721 J.S. Bach's 6 Brandenburg concertos used the structure and principles standardized by Vivaldi in his concertos. After 1773 Mozart composes his first violin concerto using the 3-movement structure. In Italy, in the 1720s, Vivaldi was best known as a composer of operas, but in Northern Europe, as well as after the composer's death, his fame rested on his concertos, a form he shaped, developed, and made his own, perhaps most famously in Le Quattro Stagioni of 1725. Since Vivaldi's day, the word concerto has found a clear meaning as a piece for one or more instrumental soloists, and an orchestra. A solo concerto showcases one musician. A concerto grosso has 2 or more. Before Vivaldi, however, the term was used more fluidly to describe works written for combined ensembles, whether of voices and instruments, or comprising different groups of instruments. In Rome, for example, Arcangelo Corelli wrote concerti grossi for an ensemble of 2 violins and keyboard. These instruments could be joined by a larger string ensemble, the role of which was more to augment than to stand in musical contrast to the smaller group. The Ospedale della Pietà, a foundling hospital on the Grand Canal in Venice, where Vivaldi became violin master in 1703. The Ospedale had an all-female choir and orchestra. The concerto develops. It was in northern Italy, and Venice in particular, that the concerto started to take the form that Vivaldi would come to use. In Bologna, violinist and composer Giuseppe Torelli wrote works for solo violin and a larger instrumental ensemble, while in Venice, wealthy amateur Tommaso Albinoni composed beautiful oboe concertos. Written for 1 or 2 oboes and a larger ensemble, they were among the first notable solo works written for the instrument. In the works of both Torelli and Albinoni, a contrast was starting to emerge between the solo sections and the parts played by the larger ensemble, as if 2 voices were being heard simultaneously within the same piece. These were the foundations upon which Vivaldi built his body of work. Slightly younger than Albinoni, his fellow Venetian, Vivaldi wrote his first known concertos when he was in his mid-20s. Overall, during the next 40 or so years, he would write around 500 concertos, many of which were published in collections such as Il Cimento dell'Armonia e dell'Invention. Others were sold in manuscript, a form that the commercially minded Vivaldi found was more profitable. Of these concertos, more than 200 were for solo violin. Vivaldi himself was a renowned and flamboyant violinist. Others were for solo bassoon, cello, flute, oboe, mandolin, and recorder. Vivaldi wrote nearly 50 double concertos, along with other variations, including one concerto that included solo parts for 16 different instruments. Through his astonishing oeuvre, Vivaldi helped to change the course of musical history. Yet he was never a revolutionary. Instead, he took existing trends and modified them, creating a new musical language that exhilarated both musicians and contemporary audiences. Many of his borrowings were from opera, another genre that found new life in the Baroque period and with which Vivaldi was heavily involved as a composer. Following in Albinoni's footsteps, he took the basic fast-slow-fast structure of the operatic overture and transformed it into the standard 3-movement structure of the concerto, a fast first movement, filled with musical action as solo and ensemble sections alternate with one another, followed by a slow, more meditative middle movement, succeeded by a renewed burst of activity in the final movement. Antonio Vivaldi. Vivaldi was born in 1678, the son of a violinist in the orchestra of St. Mark's in Venice. He initially trained for the priesthood and was ordained in 1703, but he soon ceased to practice as a priest. His break as a musician came when he was appointed violin master at Venice's Ospedale della Pietà. Vivaldi's first published collection of concertos, L'Estro Armonico, printed in 1711, made his name internationally known, especially in Germany, where the young J.S. Bach was one of its admirers. He went on to compose hundreds of other concertos, as well as some 50 operas and numerous religious vocal works, sonatas, and cantatas. His popularity had declined by the late 1730s. He died in Vienna in 1741, while trying to restore his fortunes, and was buried in a pauper's grave. Other key works: 1711 L'Estro Armonico, Op. 3, 1714 La Stravaganza, Op. 4. 1725 Il Cimento dell'Armonia e dell'Invention, Op. 8, 1727 La Cetra, Op. 9. The Ritornello. Within the fast movements, Vivaldi borrowed the key structuring device from opera. He used the ritornello, a refrain or musical idea played, repeated, and modified over the course of the movement by the orchestra. Typically in Vivaldi's work, a fast movement starts with the orchestra making a full statement of the ritornello. This gives way to a solo section, in which the musician merely receives background accompaniment from the orchestra. The full orchestra then returns, restating part of the ritornello in a new key. Ritornello and solo sections then alternate, typically 4 to 6 times, culminating in a final orchestral restatement of the ritornello. The solo sections, meanwhile, can also be seen in opera. Baroque operas gave new prominence to the aria, which allowed singers to show off the power, range, and expressive nature of their voices. Similarly, the solo sections of concertos allowed instrumental soloists to display their virtuoso skills. In an age characterized by theatricality, Vivaldi brought a dose of dramatic virtuosity to the concerto. He can compose a concerto more quickly than a copyist can write. Charles de Brosses, French scholar and politician. The concerto. The main attraction of the concerto for composers and musicians is the sheer dramatic potential of the form, as soloist and orchestra alternately compete and collaborate with one another. Many composers have been inspired to write concertos by the talents of particular performers, such as the cellist Antonin Kraft, for whom Haydn wrote his cello concerto No. 2 in D and Beethoven his triple concerto. Mozart wrote his famous horn concertos for the horn player Joseph Lutgeb. Concertos soon became a showcase for virtuoso performers, such as the violinist Paganini and the pianists Liszt and Chopin. Around the turn of the 20th century, Rachmaninoff wrote his piano concertos, and Dvorak and Elgar their much-loved cello concertos. Later, fans of the concerto grosso included Michael Tippett in his Fantasia Concertant on a theme of Corelli. Violinist Nigel Kennedy records the Four Seasons with the English Chamber Orchestra in 1989. The recording sold more than 2 million copies. The score of Spring, from the Four Seasons, part of L'Estro Armonico, a collection of 12 concertos whose lively flamboyance transformed the stately form. Four Seasons. Vivaldi allowed his theatricality free rein in the Four Seasons, first published in Amsterdam in 1725. Earlier versions of the pieces had been circulating for a number of years in manuscript form, and were already widely known and admired. Le Quattro Stagioni represented the first four in a collection of 12 violin concertos entitled Il Cimento dell'Armonia e dell'Invention, all written between 1723 and 1725. Many of Vivaldi's concertos sought to evoke or describe particular moods and states of mind, as their titles made clear, for example, Illinois Piacere, L'Inquietudine, L'Amoroso, and Il Riposo. Le Quattro Stagioni, however, along with a cycle of 3 concertos called La Notte, took this a step further, and used the music to relate a simple musical narrative known as a program, a form that was taken up by many composers in the Romantic era. In the published version, Vivaldi made the program explicit by including 4 sonnets of unknown authorship, often theorized to have been written by Vivaldi himself. These sonnets each tell the story of one of the 4 seasons. The sonnet for spring, for example, starts by describing how birds salute the new season with joyous song, and how brooks fanned by soft breezes flow with sweet murmurings. All this Vivaldi describes musically in the first movement of the Spring Concerto, where the opening ritornello is a dance representing the celebratory joy of returning spring, succeeded by 3 solo violins conveying bird song and other characteristics of the season. High praise. In Italy, Vivaldi's popularity had waned by the end of his life due to rising interest in a new Neapolitan style of opera. North of the Alps, however, Vivaldi's concertos, and Le Quattro Stagioni in particular, made him one of the most famous composers of the day. Vivaldi's patrons included the Bohemian nobleman Count Wenzel von Morsen, to whom Vivaldi dedicated Il Cimento dell'Armonia e dell'Invention, the collection that contained Le Quattro Stagioni. "I beg you not to be surprised," he wrote, "if among these few and feeble concertos your illustrious grace should find the 4 seasons which, with your noble bounty, your illustrious grace has so long regarded with indulgence." Another illustrious endorsement came from King Louis XV of France, who in November 1730 commanded a performance of this spring concerto, played by an orchestra assembled entirely of musically gifted nobles and courtiers. Another lover of this spring concerto was philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in 1775 arranged the piece for unaccompanied flute. Vivaldi played a splendid solo. Such playing has not been heard before and can never be equaled. J. F. von Offenbach. German traveler. Influence on composers. Most remarkable, however, was the legacy of Vivaldi's concertos to his fellow musicians. One notable devotee was J.S. Bach. His patron, the Duke of Saxe-Weimar, returned from a trip to the Netherlands with a copy of Vivaldi's first concerto collection, the L'Estro Armonico, published in Amsterdam. Bach transcribed 6 of the concertos for solo harpsichord, and according to his earliest biographer, Johann Nicolaus Forkel, it was this experience that taught him the importance of order, coherence, and proportion in music. According to modern scholars, Forkel's assessment may be an exaggeration, but Vivaldi's influence on Bach is clearly evident in, for example, Bach's use of the ritornello form. Equally evident is the fact that Vivaldi gave the 3-movement concerto a place among the most important music forms, inspiring countless future composers from Bach, Haydn, and Mozart to Beethoven onward. Moreover, the concerto was a major influence on another emerging form, one that soon became the supreme form of instrumental expression for composers, the symphony. See also, C.P. Bach's Flute Concerto in A major, Saint-Saëns Piano Concerto No. 2 in G minor, Ravel's Piano Concerto in D for the left hand. In context. Focus. High Baroque religious choral music before 1471. The Flemish composer Jacob Albrecht writes a Passio Secundum Mattheum. 1620s in Rome, Giacomo Carissimi produces oratorios on Old Testament subjects to satisfy the demand for operatic entertainment during Lent. 1718 Handel composes the first version of Esther, about the Old Testament queen. Eventually, in 1732, this piece would be revised into the first English oratorio. After 1829 Felix Mendelssohn conducts the Berlin premiere of the Street Matthew Passion, a key moment in the revival of interest in Bach's music. 1846 Mendelssohn premieres his oratorio Elijah, depicting the life of the prophet Elijah. 1850 The Bach Gesellschaft is formed in Leipzig by Moritz Hauptmann, Otto Jahn, and the composer Robert Schumann, in order to publish the complete works of Bach. 1963 1966 Polish composer Krzysztof Penderecki writes the St. Luke Passion, an atonal orchestral choral setting of the Passion story. The final development of the Baroque aesthetic known as the High Baroque was underway by around 1680. The new tonal system, in which music was built from notes, forming major and minor scales, was fixed by this time, and High Baroque composers such as Johann Sebastian Bach used it to control the flow of their work by modulating between different keys. Increasingly complex counterpoint, combining distinct melodic lines, one of the defining characteristics of Baroque music, was employed to create vivid dramatic effects. Coupled with incisive rhythmic features, the music achieved an unprecedented emotional power. In earlier periods, vocal art music had been preeminent. Now increasing interest in instrumental music offered composers another dramatic resource. Breaking the bounds of pure accompaniment, the ever more prominent orchestra could play a far more varied and expressive role, which helped to fuel the popularity of Baroque opera. This tended to flourish in mercantile centers, where wealthy individuals joined the nobility to enjoy the spectacle, offering rich opportunities for composers such as George Frideric Handel. Most citizens, however, experienced the new musical developments during church services. The crucifixion, often depicted in Renaissance art, as here by the German painter Lucas Cranach the Elder, became a subject for composers, too, as music grew ever more descriptive. Dramatizing church music. Composers soon realized that the operatic techniques and music that infused classical myths with contemporary relevance could serve liturgical purposes equally, bringing life to the biblical texts, which many in the congregation could not themselves read. Since operas were not permitted to be staged during the 6 weeks of Lent, composers would present performances of oratorios on biblical themes instead. Many of the genres heard in choral music of this time are the same as those found in secular music. As church composers were required to write music for more than 60 services a year, it was not unusual for them to remodel secular pieces, as Johann Sebastian Bach did when writing his Christmas oratorio. Not Brook, but C. Should he be called because of his infinite, inexhaustible richness in tone combinations and harmonies. Ludwig van Beethoven. Evolving choral genres. During the High Baroque period, the form of the Mass in North Germany evolved from the prima pratica, characterized by a polyphonic setting of the most important parts of the church service with a choir and an instrumental accompaniment, into a much grander entity. This was due partly to the influence of Italian traditions, which, after 1712, Bach encountered through the music of Antonio Vivaldi. The orchestra grew in size and, especially with obbligato accompaniments, made a much greater musical contribution. Solo voices were also more common. Bach wrote 5 masses, but the B minor Mass stands apart as one of the most important works in the Western music canon. It was written at the end of his life and unperformed before his death. Unusually for the Lutheran tradition, it presents a complete setting of the Latin ordinary in 25 separate movements over some 2 hours. Although on the wane by this period, the motet was still an important choral genre, particularly in France, where 2 distinct styles had been established. The petit motets were accompanied only by continuo, whereas the grands motets, such as those of Jean-Baptiste Lully, included soloists and an increasing number of instruments. They were less common in Germany. The best-known examples today are by Heinrich Schütz and Bach. Bach's motets, which strongly influenced Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, were virtually the only works of his to be regularly performed after his death until the Bach revival in the early 19th century. Each was arranged for different-sized choirs, and it is unclear how they were used within church services, although some were written for funerals. Other choral forms of the High Baroque period include the anthem, the Magnificat, and the madrigal. The anthem was prevalent in England, as a sectional dramatic work placing instrumental sections with solo passages, recitatives, and full choruses. Purcell was a gifted exponent of the form, and Handel took it to even greater heights. His 4 ceremonial anthems include the renowned Zadok the Priest, written for the coronation of King George II in 1727. The Magnificat, sung at Vespers and Evensong, is the canticle of the Virgin Mary from Luke's Gospel, first set in the Renaissance. Monteverdi and Vivaldi produced important Baroque settings, but Bach's Magnificat for 5 parts and orchestra is probably the best known today. Although the madrigal is more usually associated with earlier periods, this secular form for voices and accompaniment continued to be popular in the Baroque period. The subtle word painting that the madrigal engendered influenced other genres and is found in many sacred choral works of the period. Johann Sebastian Bach. Born in Eisenach, Germany, in 1685, Bach was the most prominent of a long line of musicians. Taught music first by his father, then his brother, Bach was appointed as a court musician in Weimar on leaving school in 1703. His reputation as an outstanding keyboard player quickly spread. He had soon written the first of more than 200 cantatas. In 1717, Bach moved to Cologne to take up a post-ion as Kapellmeister and wrote many instrumental works, including the Brandenburg concertos. In 1723, he took up his last post as cantor of St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, where he remained until his death in 1750 at the age of 65. During this period, he became the preeminent composer of high Baroque music, with a skill for counterpoint that has arguably never been equaled. Other key works: 1723, 1732 6 motets, BWV 225, 2311733 Magnificat, BWV 2431749 Mass in B minor, BWV 232. St. Matthew Passion. For a musician such as Bach, who was principally concerned with church music, the Passion, which set the biblical events from the Last Supper up to the Crucifixion, was an opportunity to use the dramatic techniques of opera within a religious setting. Bach wrote at least 3 such works. For its mastery of emotion, imagination, and power of expression make the St. Matthew Passion a towering monument of human creativity. It was written to be performed either side of the sermon at the Good Friday service. Bach also collaborated with the Leipzig poet Picander to create a libretto, which both presented the biblical drama and offered contemplations upon the content. The St. Thomas Church for which it was written added an extra layer of drama to proceedings. By using its 2 organ lofts, Bach was able to distribute his forces as a double choir across the venue. Although he had employed such techniques in other works, such as the motets, its use here with the addition of 2 orchestras and organists allowed for the widest variety of dramatic textures. In addition to the original material, Bach also inserted a number of Lutheran chorales. When Martin Luther had started translating services into German, new melodies had been required. These formed well-known hymns that became the mainstay of congregational worship. Bach harmonized many hundreds of such melodies, regularly using them as the basis of cantatas or chorale preludes. In the St. Matthew Passion, the chorale melodies date from between 1525 and 1656, and would therefore have been familiar to his audience. Most are presented in 4-part harmony, but 3 are referenced as accompanying elements in other movements. In this way, Bach was able to mix the known with the new, essential for a congregation first experiencing such an intense, large-scale work. One who has completely forgotten Christianity truly hears it here as gospel. Friedrich Nietzsche. Cantatas and oratorios. The oratorio had traditionally been a concert piece for orchestra, choir, and soloists, depicting a biblical episode or the life of a saint. It differed from opera only in being unstaged and lacking interaction between characters. The cantata often used similar forces but was performed in church before and after the sermon, and was a series of reflections on the service's biblical texts. Both genres used operatic elements such as recitatives, arias, and choruses, but the cantata tends to use them more subtly in order to imply the drama. By the High Baroque period, it is difficult to differentiate the cantata from the oratorio. Bach's Christmas oratorio, for example, is actually a cantata. Bach, whose cantatas are considered to be some of the most sublime religious music ever written, also wrote secular works in the genre, such as the Coffee Cantata, which is essentially a short comic opera. Musical characterization. Rather like an opera, the key roles in the Street Matthew Passion are taken by soloists, but in the absence of physical drama and costumes, Bach often gives them distinct musical characterizations. The tenor evangelist, the narrator, always uses recitative secco with continuo to deliver the gospel texts. This allows the narrative to be strong, clear, and unambiguous. The words of Jesus, however, are recitatives accompanied by the strings from the first orchestra. In playing sustained notes and highlighting key words, they add an unworldly sound to the Vox Christi, often likened to a halo. Such characterization is perhaps most strongly heard when, almost operatically, Jesus utters his last words without the accompaniment of strings, resulting in the truly devastating pathos of abandonment. However, in the hands of Bach, this same absence of strings in the soprano aria, Aus Liebe will mein Heiland sterben, suggests a different, almost plaintive mood. Throughout the work, Bach is clearly aware of the need to use the orchestra to ensure that his congregation receives the full impact of the text. This attention to orchestration, which was far more prevalent in stage works of the time, can be seen in the use of the oboes da caccia to underpin the eerie description of Golgotha in ACH Golgotha. No less vivid is the moment in Bus und Ru, where the alto describes his tears to the sound of flutes playing staccato notes. Bach played the organ and taught for 27 years at the St. Thomas School in Leipzig, as shown here in an 1882 engraving. He and his pupils supplied music for the city's 4 main churches. A large, varied cast. The piece also has parts for Judas, Peter, 2 priests, Pontius Pilate and his wife, 2 witnesses, and 2 maids, although they are not usually all taken by different soloists. In many performances, the minor soloists are also members of the choirs. With such a diverse cast and discursive text, it was also possible for Bach to break from the oratorio tradition of avoiding interaction between soloists. He included duets and crowd scenes with passages that simulate simultaneous and interjecting speakers. So in Visage uns Christi, the 2 choruses alternate in a style known as cori spezzati, which was first developed at St. Mark's in Venice, while in Her were Haben gedacht, they sing simultaneously to represent the power-hungry Pharisees. The real glory of the choruses is in the contrapuntal writing, notably when, after singing in excruciating dissonance as they call for the freedom of the prisoner Barabbas, they then embark on a series of complex musical structures notoriously difficult to perform. In earlier, particularly poignant moment follows Jesus' capture in the garden, where after a sighing orchestral introduction, the soprano and alto bemoan Jesus' fate in resigned tones. In contrast, the chorus demands his release, creating an extraordinary tension between the 2 moods. While the resignation continues, the chorus, which may depict the disciples or the congregation, gets more agitated, and the orchestra drives the music forward to a breathless conclusion. The ending of this section in the major key might seem surprising, underpinning as it does the words, "murderous blood." It is suggested, however, that the music might be reminding the listener that while the story is one of suffering, without the capture of Jesus, his crucifixion, and thereby salvation, is not possible. Elsewhere, many of the more contemplative texts, such as the chorale, Ich bin's ich soll bussen, or the bass aria, Mische Dike mein Herz rein, encourage listeners to feel the emotion and identify with the drama. The most striking example is perhaps the aria, Erbarm Dike mein Gott. The simplicity of the lilting rhythm, accompanied by a lamenting violin, underpins and emphasizes the intensity of Peter's sense of horror and guilt at his betrayal of Jesus, as he repeats the 17 words of the text with increasing anguish. The Street Matthew Passion received only a handful of performances in Bach's lifetime. The newer classical style had begun to revolutionize musical composition and enjoyment, and the composer was considered to be behind the times in writing contrapuntal music of this kind. He demands that singers should be able to do with their throats whatever he can play on the keyboard. Johann Scheib, critic and composer. The St. Thomas Boys Choir, Leipzig, still flourishing today, dates back more than 800 years to 1212. With Bach as cantor, the church and city became the center of Protestant music. The most beautiful piece of music ever written for the violin. Yehudi Menuhin. Describing Erbarm dich, mein Gott. Bach's legacy. By the end of Bach's life, his music was called learned, in the most pejorative sense. The music of his son Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach was better known. Very little of Bach's music was printed, although the keyboard works were sometimes studied. Ludwig van Beethoven often performed fugues and preludes from Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier. However, major works such as the St. Matthew Passion existed only in hand-copied examples within a very small circle of admirers, some of whom had been his students. It was through such a group that Mendelssohn came to study Bach's works in the early 19th century and put on a performance of the St. Matthew Passion in 1829. This performance, although a landmark in the revival of Bach's music, was neither complete nor authentic, but it did help to raise awareness of Bach's work. It was not long before societies were created to publish and perform his work. Today, the St. Matthew Passion is frequently presented as a staged work. With its similarities to opera, it can have a powerful effect on audiences. Bach and 3 of his sons pose for a portrait by Balthasar Denner. Bach had 20 children, and from the early 1500s to the late 1700s, his family produced more than 70 musicians. See also, Ein fest Berg ist unser Gott, the art of Fugue Elijah, the dream of Gerontius. In context. Focus to Fellmusik. Before 1650, Joachim von Sandrart's painting Das Friedensmahl depicts musicians performing Tafelmusik at a banquet for a diplomatic conference. 1680's printed collections of Tafelmusik, mostly by German composers of the day, become more common. After 1770s, the genre of Tafelmusik is gradually replaced by other types of light musical entertainment such as the divertimento and serenade. 1820, an engraving by Johann Wunder depicts the performance of Tafelmusik at a municipal banquet in Krawinkel, an invented place name intended to suggest old-fashioned, small-town parochialism. The demand for Tafelmusik, background music for banquets, grew steadily from the mid-16th century onward. Musik de Table, a collection of such music by George Philipp Telemann, a prolific German composer who relished the assimilation and mastery of different musical styles, draws together a range of chamber genres that lent themselves to Tafelmusik. Telemann marketed the collection as a prestige product that could be purchased by subscription. Telemann's collection divides into 3 productions, each one containing an orchestral dance suite, a concerto, a quartet, a trio sonata, and solo sonata, finishing with an orchestral conclusion. Apart from the dance suites, considerable use is made of the slow-fast 4-movement pattern of the traditional sonata da chiesa. Each production provides enough music for an evening's entertainment and contains meticulously crafted music that is always memorably melodious, even evoking popular folk songs at times. Handel, who was among the collection's 206 subscribers, appears to have borrowed some of its musical ideas. Themes in his oratorio The Arrival of the Queen of Sheba bear resemblance to material from the concerto in the second production of Musik de Table. He could write a church piece in 8 parts with the same expedition another would write a letter. George Friedrich Handel. See also, Corelli's Concerti Grossi Water Music, the Four Seasons C.P. Bach's Flute Concerto in A major. In context. Focus the style Galanti. Before 1607, Monteverdi's L'Orfeo, the earliest opera still in the current repertoire, is premiered in Mantua. 1673, the French operatic tradition was born with the premiere of Jean-Baptiste Lully's Cadmus et Hermione, the first of Lully's tragedies and music. After 1752, a performance of Giovanni Battista Pergolesi's opera Buffa la Serva Padrona ignites the Querelle de Buffons, a dispute between supporters of serious and comic opera. 1774 Having reformed Italian opera, Christoph Willibald Gluck composes Iphigenie in All-Eyed for the Paris stage. Gallant music was born out of opposition to the perceived complexity of Baroque music. While the latter was often characterized by seriousness and grandeur, the style Galanti was elegant, light, and immediate. One of the most lauded advocates of this style was the French composer Jean-Philippe Rameau, whose first opera, Hippolyte et Thérèse, premiered in Paris in 1733. Rameau cast his opera in the conventional five-act form of a tragédie en musique that was established by Jean-Baptiste Lully. In every other way, however, he broke Lully's mold, using daring dissonances, longer phrase structures, and an ornate approach to melodic writing that came to typify the style Galanti. War of Words. Hippolyte et Thérèse drew harsh criticism from so-called Lullists, who feared that Rameau's Italianate music threatened the iconic status of Lully's operas in French culture. The debate between Lullists and Ramistes raged for several years, during which Rameau released a further 4 operas. In time, however, his music became more accepted, and by the time of the Querelle de Buffons in 1752, a 2-year dispute about the relative merits of French and Italian opera, Rameau's music was considered typically French. U.S. mezzo-soprano Jennifer Holloway plays Diane during a rehearsal of Rameau's Hippolyte et Thérèse in the Théâtre du Capitole, Toulouse, in 2009. See also, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme Orfeo ed Eurydice, the Magic Flute, the Barber of Seville, La Traviata. In context. Focus. Baroque counterpoint before. Circa 1606, 1621 Sweelinck composes the Fantasia Chromatica, one of the first works to demonstrate contrapuntal development of a single subject. 1725 Fuchs publishes Gradus ad Parnassum, which includes exercises in how to write fugues. Mozart later studied this work. After 1837 Mendelssohn publishes 6 Preludes and Fugues, Op. 35, demonstrating the fugue as a viable romantic genre. 1910 Busoni publishes the Fantasia Contrapuntistica, a homage to the art of fugue which includes a postmodern completion of its last fugue. In contrast to later music that frequently depended on a single melody line over a series of harmonies, Baroque music was often constructed by combining a number of independent and interlacing melody lines, or voices. This technique, known as counterpoint, allowed composers to create works of overwhelming complexity and drama, reflecting the richness of other contemporary art forms. However, it also required consummate skill to compose long spans of music with sufficient variety and interest. The rise of the classical style, and its emphasis on simplicity and preference for more slowly changing harmony, reduced the need for musicians to master such complex techniques. However, Bach, the preeminent practitioner of counterpoint in the Baroque period, considered the skill to be so vital that he attempted toward the end of his life to organize and display the results of his knowledge in works such as The Art of Fugue, a cycle of some 20 fugues. The second fugue of Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier is in C minor. Both sets of 24 preludes and fugues are arranged in the 12 major and minor keys between C and the B above it. Principles of counterpoint. Much earlier, Bach had published didactic works to teach keyboard players counterpoint. These included 2 collections of special significance, the 15 Inventions in 2 parts, and the 15 Sinfonias in 3 parts. In each of the pieces, a simple opening melody is presented unaccompanied and then transferred to the other parts, while the first part continues with a complementary melody. For the performer, the difficulty of such works is not just to be able to play the often swiftly flowing parts with ease but also to be able to balance the relative importance of the voices, so that the listener can appreciate the interplay and experience a satisfying musical performance. While these works abide by the strict Baroque rules that govern dissonance when it is permitted, their structure is relatively free. Preludes, fugues, and well-tempered tuning. Bach's 2 books entitled The Well-Tempered Clavier each contain 24 preludes and fugues in all the major and minor keys. These provided models that keyboard players could use to develop their proficiency and also celebrated the range of keys that could be employed using the tuning methods of his time. Tuning, or temperament, was always a tricky issue. A note one octave apart from another sounds similar because the sound frequency can be reduced to a simple 2-to-1 ratio. Frequency ratios between other notes are more complex, so tuning to a C major scale, keeping all the intervals pure, would make other scales sound out of tune to slightly different degrees. The mean tone system, used from C.1570 and based on a pure third interval, worked well only for 10-15 of 24 keys. The well-tempered system was a compromise, tuning to intervals sufficiently equidistant to allow for performances in all keys. The modern equal temperament system divides the octave into equal, mostly impure intervals. Building a fugue. Bach was best known for his fugues, which follow the same principles but organize them within far more rigorous structures, which allow for very rich listening experiences. The basic structure of a fugue requires a melody known as the subject to be presented by the first voice in the home key. The next voice then presents the same melody but starting on the fifth note of the scale being used, and this is known as the answer. When replying to this, the original voice plays a counter-subject, which may be very contrasting. The third voice then enters with this subject, again, starting on the same note in a different octave, while the second voice now performs the counter-subject and the first voice will usually play free material derived from the subject. This continues in the same way until all the voices have entered, creating an exposition that moves rapidly from simplicity to complexity, while using limited musical material. The fugue will then progress by adding mood-changing episodes, again often derived from the opening material. The middle section, in turn, presents the subject in different keys and formats until the work returns to the opening key. However, further variants heighten this journey, such as the stretto, where subjects and answers enter before the previous ones have been resolved. When tuning a piano, such as this Schimmel concert instrument from Germany, the tuner uses a tuning fork or an electronic device to adjust the strings to the required pitch. In a fugue, a word derived from the Latin for flight, each of three or more voices enter one after the other, imitating and modifying the initial theme. The structure illustrated here has many other possible variants. Ceaseless work, analysis, reflection, writing much, endless self-correction, that is my secret. Johann Sebastian Bach. Teaching tools. In writing the 48 fugues of the Well-Tempered Clavier, Bach offered a compendium of techniques to be studied by both keyboard players and composers. These were designed as teaching tools, and although they are often performed in concert halls, they are not as powerful as his organ fugues or those found in his sacred music. However, they had a considerable influence on later composers, who dubbed them the Old Testament of music, and paid tribute to them. Shostakovich, for instance, composed 24 preludes and fugues. Even now, pianists study Bach's The Well-Tempered Clavier as part of their training. Bach's fascination with counterpoint did not merely focus on the fugue. His suites of dance movements rely on an understanding of counterpoint for their inner energy. Even when the music is for solo violin or cello, it often hints at what the other voices would play if there were more instruments by injecting notes and phrases in different registers. Bach was similarly attracted to canons, where one voice follows the exact melodic contour of the other but slightly later. His use of this technique is particularly evident in the Goldberg Variations, a set of 30 keyboard variations published in 1741, which were, he said, for connoisseurs to refresh their spirits. Based on a repeating bass line, Bach composed every third variation as a canon, but with one extra dimension. The first canon begins with both voices starting on the same note. In the next canon, however, although the second voice is playing the same tune as the first, it plays it one note higher. Here incredible skill is required to create melodic material that works and sounds pleasing to the listener's ear. The next canon presents the second voice 2 notes higher, and this continues until, in the last canon, The voices are 9 notes apart. Apparently not content with this plethora of canons, Bach had 14 more sketched out in his copy of Goldberg Variations, built on the first 8 notes of the bass line. In the musical offering, his last major keyboard work, written for the newly invented piano, Bach wrote a collection of 14 canons and fugues based on a theme purportedly composed by the King of Prussia, Frederick II. Rather than always writing out the music in full, here Bach presents some musical conundrums that have come to be called riddle fugues. In these, he writes out only the main melody, sometimes as an acrostic, and then, in Latin, briefly states what kind of canon it should be and in how many voices. The performer has to work out how to play the piece. He even includes a so-called crab canon, where the theme is played backward and forward at the same time. Interestingly, the 6-part fugue from this work, known as the Reiserkara 6, is written on 6 staves, 1 staff per voice, rather than in an arrangement for 2 hands. Bach presented the art of fugue in the same way, perhaps to suggest that it was pure music without being tied to any particular instrument. It's the most difficult thing I've ever approached. You've got to keep it going. How do you do that? There's never been anything more beautiful in all of music. Glenn Gould. Pianist. Unfinished legacy. The art of fugue is the culmination of Bach's contrapuntal interests. Written as 14 fugues and 4 canons, each one uses the same principal theme in some way to generate music of extraordinary subtlety and variety. The last fugue, or contrapunctus, as he calls them, presents a series of 3 different subjects, each worked out in 4 voices before moving to the next. The final one presents one of the most poignant moments in the history of music. Bach introduces a 4-note theme that spells out his name, but before he finishes working it out, the manuscript trails off. Glenn Gould, a brilliant 20th-century Canadian pianist, seen here recording Bach's keyboard music, was noted for his skill in clearly articulating the texture of the preludes and fugues. See also, Misselholm Armine Fest Berg ist unser Gott Street Matthew Passion Elijah Forest Requiem The Dream of Gerontius. Introduction. The 18th century was the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, a time when the old political order was giving way to a new, more inclusive society. The aristocratic courts continued to provide patronage for the arts, but the rise of an urban middle class created a new concert and opera-going audience with different tastes. The music of the period also reflected Enlightenment values of rationalism and humanism that looked to the aesthetic ideals of ancient Greece, rejecting the extravagant counterpoint of the Baroque era in favor of a more detached style that emphasized elegance and proportion. The classical period in music history began around 1750. It lasted not much more than 50 years, yet was so influential that the term classical music is widely used to refer to long-established musical traditions in general. Among the first to adopt the new style were 2 of J. S. Bach's sons, Carl Philipp Emanuel, a court musician who bridged the gap between Baroque and classical styles of music, and his brother Johann Christian, who made his name in London, staging public concerts and popularizing the newly invented piano. Some of the most exciting developments, however, were happening in Mannheim, Germany, where the court orchestra enabled composers such as Johann Stamitz to explore new musical forms, including the symphony and concerto. Opera was undergoing a similar transformation. Christoph Willibald Gluck, dissatisfied with the stilted, artificial nature of Baroque opera, began a series of reform operas, simplifying the music and aiming for a more realistic drama. The Viennese scene. As the classical style became established, composers and performers tended to gravitate toward Vienna, which was becoming the cultural as well as geographical center of Europe, with a prosperous population eager to hear new music. 3 composers stood out from the others: Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven. Haydn, although a central figure in the formation of this Viennese musical scene, was not initially a part of it. He took a conventional job as Kapellmeister at the Esterházy family's rural estate in Hungary, producing music for twice-weekly concerts. Isolated from the wider musical world, Haydn developed his own particular style. He had a staff of talented musicians and was able to both hone his skills and refine musical forms, such as the symphony, string quartet, sonata, and solo concerto. Despite the remoteness of the Esterházy estate, news of his music spread to Vienna and beyond, once it was published. As Haydn was starting his career as a court musician, a young musical prodigy from Salzburg was being paraded around the courts and concert halls by his ambitious father. A precocious genius, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart learned the elements of the new classical style as he toured Europe. Realizing he was not suited to life as a court musician, he decided to try to earn a living as a freelance composer, one of the first to do so, in Vienna. Here he met Haydn on one of his trips to the capital from Esterházy, and the two became friends. Mozart was inspired to develop his symphonies and string quartets along the same lines as Haydn had, but he also made a living, and a reputation, as a composer and performer of piano music. He later became known as the foremost opera composer of the period. Enter Beethoven. While Haydn and Mozart were at the height of their fame in the 1770s, another ambitious father had aspirations for his gifted son. Although Ludwig van Beethoven did not make it as a child prodigy, at the age of 13 he got a job as a court musician in Bonn and then became a freelance composer, performer, and teacher in Vienna. He settled there in 1792, too late to meet his hero, Mozart, who had died the year before, but he took lessons in composition from Haydn. Beethoven's early compositions, symphonies, piano sonatas, and chamber music were in the style established by Haydn and Mozart but showed signs of a more passionate temperament that differed from the classicism of his elders. In 1803, Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, extended the form of the symphony, developing and expanding expressive musical language and heralding the beginning of a new period of musical history. In context. Focus. Expanding the scope of the orchestra before 1720s composers of Neapolitan operas, such as Leonardo Vinci, write Sinfonie in 3 movements as preludes to their dramatic works. 1732 Italian composer Giovanni Battista Sammartini begins to write a series of 3-movement symphonies. After 1766 in Paris, Mozart befriends the Mannheim composer and conductor Christian Cannabich, a pupil and follower of Stamitz. 1772 Haydn, in his Sturm und Drang symphonies, further explores the emotive style of orchestral music pioneered by the Mannheim composers. In 1741, the composer Johann Stamitz moved from his home in Bohemia to Mannheim, capital of the Electro-Palatinate, a German territory. There he became court violinist and, in 1745, was appointed concertmaster of the orchestra. Stamitz raised the standards of orchestral playing, hiring talented musicians, some of whom were also composers in their own right, and extended the orchestra by adding wind instruments, such as oboes and horns. He directed this diverse group, not from the keyboard, as had previously been the norm, but from his desk at the head of the violin section, using his bow to signal the start of the piece and to indicate rhythm and tempo. Under Stamitz, the Mannheim Orchestra became renowned for the superb quality and precision of its playing and for the new soundscape that it created. Many of the works played by Stamitz's Mannheim Orchestra were symphonies, a form that had originated in Italy as the prelude, or overture, to operas but had now become part of the Baroque concert repertoire. These works usually consisted of 3 movements, 1 slow between 2 fast. Stamitz's musical home Mannheim, seen here in an engraving of 1788 showing the Elector's Castle, court church, and armory, became a center of music innovation. The wind instruments could not be used to better advantage. They lift and carry, they reinforce and give life to the storm of the violins. C.F.D. Schubart. Poet, organist, and composer. The Symphony Reinvented. In the Symphony in E-flat, and other works, Stamitz took hold of the symphony form and transformed it, creating many of the features that distinguish its musical style. he added an extra movement, a minuet with a contrasting section, called a trio, because it was originally meant to be played by 3 musicians. He also adopted the sonata form, used in the opening movement of the E-flat symphony, in which the first theme, played in the home key by the full orchestra, is contrasted with a second theme, here played by the oboes, in the dominant key. This is followed by a development section, with the first movement concluding on a recapitulation of the second theme, this time in the home key. This sonata form became the template for symphonic writing in the classical period, particularly in first movements.